Hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank everyone for being here. I would also like to thank my committee members, Professor David Escaramuzza, Professor Dinesh Manocha, Professor Indrajit Chopra, Professor Yanis, and Dr. Cornelia. Welcome to my thesis defense entitled Activision-Based Embodied AI Design for Nano-UAV Autonomy. I'm Nitin from the Perception and Robotics Group at the Department of Computer Science here at UMD. I'm advised by Professor Yanis Alemanos and Dr. Cornelia Fermilla. So just one second. So before we start discussing about the work in this research, let's start with a few philosophical questions. The first question is, what is perception? The perception is the ability to see, hear, or become aware of something through somebody's senses. So the next question is, okay, why would we need perception? I would argue that we need perception for action. If we do not have to act upon something, it kind of makes not much reason to do perception. So then the next question is, okay, is action more important or is perception more important? Which should given a higher priority if you were to construct a brain from the ground up? I would argue that it's a chicken and egg problem, and both are equally important, and you would need one for the other. And if you do not have to act, you do not need the perception. And if you need to act, you cannot do it without perception. So from the last 3 decades, like people have been approaching vision through what is called as passive approaches of perception. So in the background, you see a set of images which show dogs and like food. Like in the top left, we see like muffins and a photo of a dog. And as humans, it's very easy for us to distinguish between the dog and the muffin. And that's partially because we are very well trained at this. And also it's because like, if we are unsure if something is a dog or a muffin, we will basically move around, or we probably try to poke at the dog, see if it's going to bark or do something. And so this is the active nature of how human beings operate, or even like other animals, how they operate. So if you're unsure, you basically move around, gather more information, or you interact with the object. So in this work, we'll focus on the first part, which is the activeness of the agent, which is moving around to get more information. So if we do a plot of size versus autonomy, where autonomy is described as the number of tasks or the amount of tasks the drone or a quadrotor can accomplish within some given time budget in some constraint of computation and sensing, we would see that as the size of the quadrotor decreases, the amount of autonomy also goes down. So in general, the smaller quadrotors are safer, more agile, but unintelligent. So the larger ones, on the other hand, are the exact opposite. They're dangerous, they're bulky, but they're super smart because they can have a lot of computation and they can have a lot of sensors on board. So clearly, as we come to different size quadrotors, the size, weight, area, and power, or commonly known as swap constraints, change. So we also want to adapt our philosophy accordingly, instead of just using the same hammer to beat it for different sizes. So as the quadrotors are bigger, passive vision, like we discussed before, is enough. But as we go smaller, we need to adapt a new philosophy, which is the active nature. Here, active nature means that we can move the agent or the quadrotor to gather more information as we require to solve the perception task at hand. So in a tightly integrated sensory motor loop. So clearly, we are only also talking about onboard sensing and computation here. So to summarize, size does matter when it comes to quadrotors and the amount of sensors they have. So we need to compensate for having cheaper sensors with having more action, or basically moving to gather more information. So now the plot becomes interesting when we bring in like nature's agents into the same plot. So we clearly see that with differences in the insect or the bird sizes, the level of autonomy does not vary that much. Even the sizes are drastically different. Like the bee, for example, can do almost all the things a sparrowhawk can do. Maybe not as well, but it can still achieve the same tasks. So, and we need to go to that level of autonomy. So the next obvious question which comes to the mind is, okay, why do we need smaller drones? Like if they're so harder to build. So they're safer, they are more agile, and they can be easily distributed at swarms. So like if we want to deploy 1,000 of these robots, it's much easier to do if the robots are smaller. So then the next obvious question is, why onboard sensing and autonomy? Why not just use an offboard computer to just be like, okay, we can just do the things on offline? So one is it's more secure. So it respects the user's data privacy. So people will be more open to accepting like smaller drones around them. So because it cannot, if we are saying that it's not going to store your the person's face, or it doesn't have the resolution to do it, people will be more open to adapting that in the real life. So then the next thing is it's more robust to signal failures like external things like GPS or like a motion capture setup. So it's nicer because we can do everything on board. And then it can be easily deployed in the wild as well, because like we discussed before, it can be deployed as swarms and in unstructured environments because everything is done on board and it does not rely on external infrastructure. Now let's look at a video to see the stark contrast between the strategies used by birds and bees in solving the task of going through narrow gaps. Birds and insects are masters of flight. Birds solve the complex navigation task of flying through narrow gaps at high speed with relative ease, as they have adapted their eyes to sense at high speed. But life is not that simple when you're an insect. You just do not have the good quality eyes or the computation power. You need to wander around the gap and then servo towards it. So clearly the bee is more active. It's moving around the scene to gather more information like we discussed before. So this is called the active approach to perception. And so then the question arises, should we think like the bird or should we think like the bee? Well, that depends upon the task and the amount of size, weight, area, and power constraints we have. In this work, we derive inspiration from both birds and the bees, but we are more focused towards the bees because we want to make the quadrotor as small as possible. So bringing the plot from before. So as a spoiler alert, using this active minimalist drone design, we can achieve a quadrotor which is slightly more autonomous than a 330 millimeter bebop drone at the size of a 120 millimeter. And the quadrotor looks something like this. So now if we want to talk more and place this in context to what the state of the art is, this is what it would look like. So the robot has more computation power in terms of amount of neurons than a sparrowhawk. It weighs around the same as a big sparrowhawk. It's around the size of a hummingbird, but in terms of capabilities, that is similar to that of a bee or slightly lower than that of a bee. So now I'll place this work in the context to the state of the art. Again, we have the size versus autonomy chart. And at the smallest scale, we see the bio-inspired design with no onboard computation or power. So these are all tethered beings, and they showcase that mechanically one can build agents at milligrams of scale. As we go slightly larger, we can take off-the-shelf components, we can put like very lightweight cameras and a little bit of microcontrollers, and we can start going up in autonomy level. Okay. Yeah, with slightly more custom hardware, we can also go up in autonomy level again, and we can slightly go up in size as well because we can start putting in more and more sensors. So as we go further, like we can have better computers and more number of sensors. And this is one of those things which shows that a smartphone can be used to do onboard computation and sensing. So here I also show Skydio 2, which is currently the most advanced consumer autonomous drone. And this is a fine example of what custom hardware and software which uses both active and passive vision can do. So Skydio can also do onboard SLAM, which is reconstructing the entire environment, but it also uses like perception and planning into one single loop where it can move around the scene to gather more information. Finally, when we get to the rightmost part of the scale, which is like the large size drones, we can have hardware which is like a LiDAR and which gives directly depth, and we can have enough computing power on board that we can reconstruct the scene in 3D pretty fast, and the level of autonomy goes up. The impressive part here is that Skydio, though it's much smaller than the state-of-the-art bigger drones, they can do the same level of autonomy by using a slightly different philosophy. So again, I want to place our work into context of the state of the art. So as we see, as years have gone by, we have gone down in size, but we've also gone up in autonomy. Let's actually see how this was possible. So we did this by reimagining each agent as a series of hierarchy of competences, where we said, okay, in each hierarchy, the top level hierarchy needs the ones below it. So the first hierarchy is that we need to start with kinetic stabilization, which deals with estimating its own odometry or ego motion so that the quadrotor can stabilize itself in space. So then we want to do segmentation of independently moving objects. We want to know what the dynamic obstacles are, which do not move like how we are moving. So we want to maybe avoid them, or maybe that's a break. Then we use these two informations to get both static and dynamic obstacle avoidance. Finally, we can combine the odometry measurements to do homing. And then finally, we can use all these competences to do landing on a target. So this was one single agent, but we can keep extending this work further to multiple agents as well. So if we have two agents, we can do cooperative landing. We can land one quadrotor on another one when it's flying. And this might be useful for fueling purposes. And if we have more agents, we can also do swarm pursuit and avoidance. So we just talked about the philosophy of activeness, but there are various ways to achieve the same amount of activeness. So let's start looking at, okay, how we can achieve the same amount of activeness in an agent. So the first form of activeness is the most obvious form, which is by moving the entire agent itself to move and gather more information. In this case, we see an example of a robot like moving around the scene, like moving its head like complete body to get more information. In the first work, we present a method to detect and fly through a gap of unknown shape, location, and size using just a simple monocular camera. So on the top left, we see the competence chart from before, and the things which are in color are showing what competences were triggered by this particular work. And the things in gray are the ones which were not triggered by this work. So the motivation behind this work was that if we are in a disaster scenario where we have a lot of debris, we want to deploy a fleet of drones, which are small, and they have to enter through openings of random shapes and sizes. And they might have to exit out of openings which are of different shapes and sizes, because you want to explore the scene as soon as possible for survivors and to make a map of this building. So just like the bee, our approach starts by surveying the scene by taking multiple snapshots. The motion is controlled in a way that the optical flow becomes only a function of inverse depth. Multiple observations are combined to reduce noise, and finally, a detection of the gap is obtained. However, tracking the contour is hard, unstable, and prone to drift. So instead, we employ a strategy to track the foreground and background regions separately, actively switching between them as required. We successfully evaluate and demonstrate the proposed approach in many real-world experiments with different settings and window shapes. We can fly through gaps at speeds of 2.5 meters per second with a combined detection and tracking accuracy of over 85%. Here, we see the quadrotor flying through narrow gaps with minimum tolerances of just 9, 7, and 5 centimeters respectively. We can clearly see that we can do things which can be achieved by birds with ease by using an alternative philosophy like the bee. Moving further, activeness can be also done in a totally different form. It's done by utilizing an active sensor. Such a sensor is a motion detector and only works when either the camera or the object in view is in motion. So a simple example of such a camera is an event-based camera. EV.net was born out of a collaboration between our lab and Professor Scaramuzza from the University of Zurich. So in nature, a bird's real life is very different. You often encounter predators or your not so friendly neighbor trying to attack you. To solve the problem of dodging, these masters of flight have evolved to sense at high speed with low latency even at night. Here is how a dynamic dodging looks like. So we throw objects at the drone and the drone tries to avoid them. So now let's dive deeper into the inner working of how exactly this works. So before we understand how this exact software stack works, we need to also understand what the hardware setup is. So we have a front-facing camera, we have a down-facing camera, an IMU, and a sonar altimeter for the altitude. So instead of obtaining data from the real world by crashing multiple drones, which is expensive and arduous, we obtain data for our neural network by simulating objects of different shapes, sizes, and color flying at different environments of different backgrounds. And we see that here. And the objects which were used to train the network are shown here. You can see that they're of completely different complex structures. They are different textures and shapes and sizes. So the actual software architecture is as follows. All our neural networks are trained in simulation. However, the real data looks very different from simulation as it suffers from noise, which are hard to model. Instead of making the neural networks larger to make them resilient to noise at every stage, we propose to use a shallow neural network for pre-processing the raw event frames to remove noise and motion blur. We call this EVD blur net. Next, using the down-facing camera, we assume that the camera is looking at a planar surface in the real world, and we estimate the odometry using a EV homography network. Then we use this odometry information to warp the front event frames to compensate for the motion. And then we feed this into a network called the EV-sec flow net, which outputs something called a segmentation flow. The idea behind segmentation flow is that it only gives optical flow at the parts of the image where there are dynamic obstacles. And everywhere else, it should give you a very small value. And so this can directly be used to dodge dynamic obstacles. So these were the real world objects we threw at the drones to dodge them. We successfully evaluate and demonstrate the proposed approach in many real-world experiments with obstacles of different shapes and sizes. To our knowledge, this is the first deep learning-based solution to the problem of dynamic obstacle avoidance using event cameras on a quadrotor with a success rate of 70%. We also apply the proposed strategy to evade fast dynamic objects such as drones and territorial birds. By merely reversing the control policy, we also accomplished the pursuit task, proving that a navigation stack can cater to different scenarios. Also, the most impressive part of our research is that our models were only trained in simulation and directly transferred to the real world without any fine-tuning or retraining, which highlights the generalizability of our method. In the next work, I present EV-PropNet, which was born out of a collaboration between our lab and Professor Guido de Kroon at TU Delft. Moths rule the night skies with the remarkable vision adapted for low light. An evolutionary war between the moths and their prime predator, the bats, led to the moths to develop amazing eyes to detect bats during complete darkness. They use these amazing eyes to jam their sonar so that they can survive. So, like we said before, moths use their dynamic, they detect the wing beat of the bat to detect where they are, and they detect how far they are. And then they use the sonar to jam the bat so that they don't get hunted. Inspired by the moth, we present EV-PropNet, a deep learning-based solution to detect malicious and unmarked drones. Since we want to detect unmarked drones, instead of relying on the appearance of the drone, we find the ubiquitous part of any drone, its propellers. We utilize the fact that the propellers are the fastest moving parts on a drone, and so that we can find them. And this is easier to do with an event camera because of its lack of motion blur and high temporal resolution, high dynamic range. EV-PropNet is trained only on simulated data and transfers to the real world without any fine-tuning or retraining. To generate the training data, we first model the geometry of the propeller and then simplify its shape for the projection on an event camera. And we use this data to train a network, which directly transfers to the real world. So we present two specific applications of our work. So the first one is we track and follow an unmarked drone by using onboard sensing and computation. We obtain an impressive success rate of 92% for this application. The top drone view with the detections highlighted in green are shown on the bottom. And here are the Vicon estimates for the tracking experiment. In the second application, we land or dock on a hovering drone for infiltration or refueling purposes, again using onboard computation and sensing. We obtained an impressive success rate of 90% for this application. Our network can detect propellers at a success rate of 85% even when 60% of the propeller is occluded, and it can easily run up to 35 Hz on a 2-watt power budget using the Google Coral Accelerator. To our knowledge, this is the first deep learning-based solution for detecting propellers to detect drones. And here we see an image of our method working on totally different shapes of propellers when it was trained only on simulation. And we also see adverse lighting conditions like the third image on the top row, that like even with a super bright light versus a dark background where the normal camera is failing to expose for both, the event camera excels at this task. And we also see the same thing with the super dark environment on the bottom right. So the next form of activeness is by moving a part of the body. Such a method can move either the head, in this case, or it could be basically the movement of just the eyes, like humans do with microsaccades. And such a method is useful for larger robots where moving the entire agent might not be feasible. You might be wondering, does this even make sense? Do animals even do this? So this is a video of an owlet which is doing its head bobbing motion to achieve an activeness in nature. So in this work, activeness is built into the way the sensor is mounted and the way it's movable, like we discussed before, which makes the movement quicker and more power efficient. Stereo cameras suffer from the problem of limited depth sensing range. So based on the baseline, we would have depth invalid regions when it's either too close or too far from the camera. As we see, the error in depth is directly proportional to the square in the depth and is inversely proportional to the baseline of the camera. To solve this, we take inspiration from eagles. Eagles have evolved with eyesight up to 8 times stronger than that of ours. They use these amazing eyes to hunt down the prey size of a rabbit from a distance of up to 4 miles away. They do that by constantly adapting their eyes such that their depth sensing range is at an optimal value for tracking. Inspired by eagles, we developed a stereo vision system for quadrotors that can change its baseline to adapt its depth sensing range based on the task. Such a design makes the quadrotor morphable and have an optimal depth sensing range for the required task. We use 2 linear servo motors here to change the baseline of our stereo camera setup. So we present 3 applications of this work. In the first application is flying through a forest by navigating through the trees and traveling towards a goal direction. On the bottom bar here, we see a current and history of baselines as a jet color map, wherein we go from blue to red for indicating 100 millimeters to 300 millimeters. Here, we see our quadrotor navigating through a complex forest with ease at up to speed of 5 meters per second, with all the computation and sensing being done on board. We adjust the baseline in proportion to the closest depth in the current image in this method. So the second application is flying through a static or a dynamic gap of unknown shape, size, and location. We detect the gap by clustering the depth values obtained. However, tracking the gap is hard. Instead, we track the foreground and background regions separately for better robustness, like we did in the work gap flight. When we lose track, we redetect the gap by clustering depth values and fly through it. We can fly through gaps at speeds of up to 3 meters per second with a minimum tolerance of just 4 centimeters. We adjust the baseline based on the median distance to the gap here. The final application we present is to detect an independently moving object in either 3 dimensions for dodging or pursuit. We can clearly see that with the variable baseline camera, the baseline is constantly being adjusted as the object moves farther away. As we move farther from the camera, the smaller baseline starts failing, but the larger baseline starts working as we move farther from the camera, but it does not work when it's closer. On the contrary, our method can detect the object throughout its entire range by changing its baseline in proportion to the depth of the image. As the robot becomes older and wiser, it has been through a lot of experiences and has learned a memory map of what is important. This form of activeness, which is based on memory recall, is called activeness by hallucination. This is analogous to how we humans learn things and we can recall from memory what we had actually learned before. So if the robot sees an image like this, it knows what is important, it knows what to focus on. And if I plot that as a heat map where the red color shows the important objects, we clearly see that it is showing importance on the monitor, the cupboard, and the painting and the other monitor. Here, in this work, we present a method for monocular visual odometry, which selects features based on the image saliency we just saw before. Visual odometry deals with the problem of answering the question of how did I move with just a simple camera. So if I show this image from before and ask you the question, what are you looking at? And mostly the answer is going to be the monitor, the painting, and the cupboard, because they are the most interesting parts. And it's generally not the wall. And if we plot this as a heat map from before, we see something like this. And this is also called visual saliency. And the way one would obtain this is by putting eye tracking goggles on human beings and collecting a lot of data. And we would then see, okay, which part of the image did most of the humans focus on? And we would call that salient or important. And that's what it looks like here. So from before, we have a simple image and we pass it through a GAN network, which gives us this saliency we just saw before. And it would look something like this. But as we can observe that the saliency is fuzzy, though it still relies somewhere in the middle of the object, we want the object to have the same saliency all around. For this, we use a scene parsing network where the scene is parsed, where we don't care about the labels, we just care about where the boundaries are. So we combine these two to get a saliency map, which is showing us the importance in salience, in which part of the image is important, by how much, by combining the scene parsing information. So we have a uniform saliency throughout that part of the image. So if we start selecting features using this method, it would look something like this. With uniform sampling, we see that textureless regions like walls and floor are also being selected, which is not optimal for doing visual odometry. With saliency, this becomes better, but it's still fuzzy because like we saw before, like the saliency is fuzzy. But combining scene parsing and saliency, the features are selected on important things like the painting and the couch and the light here, so which becomes more important. Comparing our method with the baseline method DSO, we clearly see that in the zoomed in picture that the drift across multiple loops of the same environment, that they align much better. This shows that our method has a lot lower drift compared to DSO. So clearly also DSO has more scale drift as seen in the top on the left image, and it also has a lot more optimization failures as seen on the right compared to our method. Here we see in action our method constructing a map and also doing the odometry online. So we achieve 83% better results than DSO, 340% better than SVO2, and 770% better than ORB-SLAM1 without loop closure. And this was the state of the art 2 years ago. So keen thinkers might have observed that one needs to also think about hardware when we talk about activeness, as they're tightly coupled. Depending upon the amount of sensing, depending upon the amount of computation we have, the type of activeness which we described before, the 4 types, one would need to use one of them. So in this study, we analyze how something like that comes into play. Like we had the chart from before, we saw that we went up in autonomy. The way we did this over the years is through an extensive analysis of how different neural network architectures behave on different computing hardware. We call this hardware and software co-design problem as Embodied-AI. So let's do a plot of weight versus frames per second. One would expect that a graph would increase. As the weight goes up, the speed of the computer also should go up. Here, the size of the bubble shows the amount of volume that is used by the computer, and that would generally be directly correlated with the weight. However, when we did the study with real data, we saw a few computers which complied with what we thought made sense. But we also had a few outliers. And these outliers were based on the amount of hardware optimization and the quantization used. And furthermore, outliers were observed, and we observed that the smaller the computer, they were better optimized for integer operations, and the larger the computer, they were optimized for floating point operations. Such considerations, which are not obvious, are important when we are designing algorithms for aerial robots or any small mobile robots in general. Another non-obvious observation is that as the depth or width of the network increases on the x-axis, while keeping the memory constant, one would assume that the frames per second would decrease. But that's not the case. We clearly see with the circle that there is a small peak somewhere in the middle of the range. And that happens because of the amount of memory accesses and convolution filters being optimized for that particular hardware architecture. And things like these are important to be considered when we are designing methods for aerial robots. So finally, I will present our ongoing work, which is to build the world's first prototype of a RoboBee Hive for artificial flower pollination. The Hive drone is a quadrotor itself, and it has a bunch of bee quadrotors, which uses GPS to navigate to a location, in this case, towards a tree. It then goes and perches onto the tree, and then uses a depth camera to find the tree and latch onto it. Once it does that, it's going to open its flaps so that the smaller quadrotors can take off from it. So we are also currently, the bee quadrotor looks like this, but we are also currently manufacturing a custom hardware which can have better computation on board so that we can also make this quadrotor even smaller. Then the bee tries to navigate towards a target sector to find a flower where it might encounter a bird or something which is, it might encounter a bird or other moving obstacles. So it dodges them by detecting these obstacles. So it uses a combination of the works we talked about in EV dodge and some other works and combines them into one entity to find objects which were not moving like the way it was. So then we further move and find the flower. We perform a soft landing on the flower to collect the pollen. And then we move to another flower to drop the pollen off. And we continue doing this until the battery is low, where we can use the homing algorithm to come back to the beehive. So to conclude the talk, I'm going to summarize what we just talked about. So we did rethink autonomy in mobile robots as a series of hierarchical competences. We used the concept of active vision as a unifying framework to combine perception, planning, and control. We demonstrated different forms of activeness as an effective means for algorithmic design for autonomy. We thought of each task as test, operate, test, exit using sensory motor loops, where planning, perception, and control were combined into one entity, and they were repeated until the task was completed. We achieved scalable autonomy in mobile robots using a synergistic hardware and software co-design. So now I'm going to talk about the future directions of this work. So we need to develop a formalism on activeness for mobile robots. We just talked about 4 different forms of activeness, but there is no one mathematical model which says, okay, which of these methods should I actually use for that particular kind of robot? And we need to develop a formalism on that. We need to study how to conceal these active movements in nonverbal HRIQs. So for example, if we have a humanoid robot which is using active vision, maybe we can do nod. We can nod its head to show that, okay, it's understanding what the human is saying, but also while gathering more information for things in the next thing. We also need to study the interplay between active and interactive perception. The active perception was just moving the agent, but that's just half of the story in the life of an agent. We also need to talk about interactive perception, which is basically how we can interact with the objects, how we can move around the objects where the grasping and all these things come in. We also need to design formal principles to evaluate hardware and software co-design, which we just talked about. We need to come up with a more formal method, which will entail different computational architectures. We need to work with more computer engineers to work with in this domain. We also need to study the role of memory in the unification of perception, planning, and control, like in the example of hallucinated activeness. We also need to model how agent morphology influences activeness. If an agent can fly and maybe fold its wings, how would this impact how activeness can be used? That is an important consideration. So then we also need to work on active perception for multiple heterogeneous agents. We just talked about a single agent, but we can also do the same thing for multiple set of agents. Here are a list of contributions during my doctoral work. The red highlights show peer-reviewed journals, while the orange highlights show peer-reviewed conferences. So I would also like to thank all the sponsors for sponsoring this work and all the fellowships I obtained during my PhD study. I would like to also thank all my collaborators and co-authors. I would first like to thank Professor Yanis and Cornelia, who have treated me like their own child by always being there and giving me a lot of creative freedom for research. Professor Scaramuzza and Dick Roon for teaching me to be a better writer, a better experimentalist, and an overall better researcher. Professor Chopra for giving me the opportunity to teach a graduate class in the aerospace department. Chahat for being the best friend, housemate, lab mate, road trip partner, and being there during all the astrophotography expeditions. It would not have been possible without you to fix all the Linux issues. And I enjoyed discovering all the math principles with you. And Chetan for getting me involved with all the event work and getting me involved with the spiking neural networks. Your neuroscience approach to robotics has helped me look at the problems with a different viewpoint. And Huaijen and Kanishka for helping with Ross and all the co-authoring in all the papers. And finally, Varun and Ashwin for the help with real-world experiments for all the papers. And I would also like to thank all the other master students who worked with me to either develop the hardware, develop the software, or anything with respect to the research. And PRG has always been a family to me, and I would dearly miss it. So the next question is, what would I be doing next after my PhD? So I would be starting off as an assistant clinical professor at the University of Maryland in the Department of Fire. And I would also continue as a postdoctoral researcher in the same lab. And all the codes in this research work are open source and open hardware and can be found on my website. And thank you for your attention.